A war against Iran would not merely be expensive or difficult for the United States. It would be potentially fatal for American dominance in the Middle East, for its global leadership position, and for its domestic political cohesion. I have spent weeks analyzing every dimension of this looming conflict, and what I have discovered should terrify anyone who understands the real stakes involved. The military buildup we are witnessing around Iran is not a sign of American strength. It is a trap that could destroy everything the United States has built over the past 80 years of global leadership. And the most dangerous part is that the people making these decisions in Washington either do not understand this reality or are choosing to ignore it for political reasons that have nothing to do with American national security interests. Hey everyone, I'm Michael Harris, geopolitical and military analyst, and you're watching my channel. Before we dive into this critical analysis, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What I'm about to share with you is the kind of deep strategic thinking that you will not find in mainstream media coverage. Drop a comment with your thoughts as we go through this together, and share this video with anyone who needs to understand why this war would be catastrophic for American interests. Now let's get into exactly why a military confrontation with Iran could mark the beginning of the end for American global hegemony. The trap of inevitable quagmire is something that Washington seems determined to ignore despite overwhelming historical evidence staring them directly in the face. The recent experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated in spectacular fashion the fundamental limitations of conventional military power when facing a determined adversary fighting on their own territory with popular support. But here is what the war planners in the Pentagon seem to be forgetting or deliberately ignoring. Iran is neither Iraq nor Afghanistan. This is a nation of 85 million people with considerable strategic depth, a sophisticated military apparatus that has been preparing for exactly this scenario for nearly 5 decades, and most importantly, an ideological determination forged through 47 years of resistance against Western pressure and sanctions. The Islamic Republic did not survive 8 American presidents, decades of crippling economic sanctions, and a devastating 8-year war with Iraq, supported by the West, by being weak or unprepared for conflict. Military analysts who have examined the planning documents talk about a campaign requiring several weeks or even several months of continuous strikes to achieve meaningful military objectives against Iranian infrastructure. But this optimistic assessment rests on a fundamentally flawed assumption that should concern every strategic thinker: that Iran would behave like a conventional adversary and simply absorb punishment without mounting an effective and devastating response. The reality would be entirely different, and anyone who has seriously studied Iranian military doctrine understands this perfectly well. Iranian officials have clearly articulated their strategy in public statements that Western analysts inexplicably continue to dismiss as mere rhetoric or empty threats. If the United States launches an attack against Iranian territory, the response will not target American territory, which is inaccessible to Iranian conventional forces. Instead, it will target every single American base throughout the entire Middle Eastern region. This would drag the entire region into a devastating war that nobody can control once it starts. That is not empty bravado from a weak adversary trying to appear strong on the international stage. That is a strategic doctrine backed by 47 years of careful preparation and very real military capabilities that have been tested and proven effective. Here is something that should keep Pentagon planners awake at night and that you need to understand to grasp the full picture. Those ballistic missiles that Washington demands Iran abandon in any negotiation constitute precisely the reason why a war would be catastrophic for American interests and regional stability. During the 12-day war in June 2025, these missiles demonstrated their terrifying effectiveness by partially saturating Israeli missile defense systems, killing 28 civilians in direct strikes, and hitting military targets with precision that genuinely surprised Western intelligence analysts who had underestimated Iranian capabilities. Since then, the Iranian missile program has not been weakened by the strikes as planners had hoped. It has been strengthened, dispersed across multiple hidden locations, and adapted based on lessons learned from that conflict. The new K-bar-class missiles can reach Israel in just 12 minutes, traveling at speeds exceeding 12,000 miles per hour, far too fast for current missile defense systems to reliably intercept. These are not theoretical capabilities discussed in intelligence briefings. They have been tested in actual combat conditions and demonstrated to work effectively. The American and Israeli strikes from June certainly damaged some Iranian installations, and that damage was real and significant. That is undeniable based on satellite imagery and intelligence assessments. But far from dismantling the nuclear and missile programs as the strikes were intended to do, those attacks triggered rapid adaptation, dispersion of assets to hardened locations, and infrastructure hardening that has made subsequent targeting far more difficult and uncertain. The nuclear facilities reveal this remarkable capacity for resilience in ways that commercial satellite imagery has documented extensively for anyone willing to look objectively at the evidence. Recent satellite images obtained by independent analysts show that the mountain facility at Fordow, which sits beneath 1,600 meters of solid granite rock with installations buried several hundred meters underground, has been considerably reinforced since the June strikes, with fresh construction clearly visible. Fresh concrete has been poured in massive quantities to protect tunnel entrances and critical infrastructure components. Iranian officials describe this facility as virtually invulnerable to any conventional weapon in existence. And based on the geological analysis, they may not be exaggerating that claim. Even the most powerful conventional bunker-busting bombs in the American arsenal, the 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, are not guaranteed to reach targets at that depth through solid granite mountain rock. But wait, because this situation gets even more complicated for American military planners trying to develop effective strike packages. The Natanz facility, despite being severely damaged during the June operations with significant destruction documented in satellite imagery, has been entirely covered with a new roof structure within just a few months of remarkably rapid construction. This new construction serves two important strategic purposes that reveal sophisticated Iranian thinking about information warfare. It completely hides whatever reconstruction or new activity is happening underneath from satellite observation, making damage assessment impossible, and it maintains strategic ambiguity about the actual state of Iranian capabilities, forcing planners to guess about what they are targeting. Iran is deliberately and skillfully playing on Western uncertainty about the true state of their programs. The Iranian leadership has transformed the partial destruction of their facilities into negotiating leverage by allowing doubt to persist about the real state of their capabilities and recovery progress. This strategy of deliberate ambiguity considerably complicates any American military planning process. You simply do not launch $5 million cruise missiles at targets without precisely identifying what you are hitting, especially when those targets might be carefully constructed decoys designed to absorb strikes or installations that are already inoperative and abandoned. Now, I need you to understand what truly represents the strategic nightmare for Washington, because it is not the hardened underground sites or the uncertainty about what is hidden beneath newly constructed roofs. The real nightmare that should concern every American strategist is that any serious military campaign against Iran simply cannot be limited to a few surgical strikes against visible nuclear facilities and known missile sites. To truly bring the Islamic Republic to its knees militarily, as certain hawkish military planners and neoconservative advisors suggest is the necessary objective, you would need to destroy not only nuclear installations and missile launch sites, but also comprehensively neutralize the Revolutionary Guards Corps, their numerous bases scattered across the country, their command and control centers, their extensive weapons depots, their training facilities for both domestic forces and regional proxies, and their communications infrastructure that ties everything together. We are talking about hundreds or potentially thousands of individual targets dispersed across a territory of more than 600,000 square miles of mountainous terrain that is ideally suited for defensive operations and concealment of military assets. Does the United States possess the military capability for such an ambitious and sustained campaign? In theory and on paper, absolutely yes. 3 carrier strike groups with their combined air wings, hundreds of advanced combat aircraft positioned at bases throughout the region, B-2 stealth bombers on maximum alert status capable of penetrating any air defense system, nuclear attack submarines capable of launching salvos of Tomahawk cruise missiles from positions throughout the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea where they cannot be effectively targeted. This is genuinely an impressive military force by any historical measure, perhaps the most powerful strike force ever assembled against a single adversary. But this force must operate from distances of 1,000 miles or more from many of its targets deep inside Iranian territory, requiring constant aerial refueling that creates vulnerable points over contested airspace defended by increasingly capable air defense systems against an integrated defense network that has had months to prepare for exactly this scenario and that now benefits from direct combat experience gained during the June strikes when they learned American tactics and vulnerabilities. And most critically and most often overlooked in hawkish analysis, this massive force operates without secure ground bases in the immediate region from which to conduct sustained high-tempo operations over weeks or months. Here is what the mainstream media is consistently not telling you about the diplomatic situation that constrains American military options. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey have all firmly refused to authorize the use of their airspace or their territory for attacks against Iran. This categorical refusal from supposed allies is not a minor logistical inconvenience that can be worked around with aerial refueling and longer flight times. It reveals an uncomfortable truth that Washington prefers to ignore and that media coverage consistently downplays. Even America's closest allies in the region, who have their own serious conflicts with Tehran, absolutely do not want a full-scale war against Iran. Why would they refuse to support an American operation against their regional rival? Because they understand far better than anyone in Washington what such a war would mean for their own security, stability, and economic survival. These are nations that would bear the immediate and devastating consequences of Iranian retaliation through missile strikes, proxy attacks, and potential disruption of oil exports. They are nations whose economies depend entirely on stable oil exports that would be disrupted by any conflict in the Gulf. They are nations with significant Shia minority populations that could become domestically destabilized by a war perceived as Western aggression against a Muslim nation. Their unanimous refusal to participate tells you absolutely everything you need to know about how regional experts who actually understand the dynamics assess the wisdom of this military adventure. Let me talk now about something that absolutely nobody in Washington wants to discuss openly or honestly with the American public: civilian casualties and the humanitarian catastrophe that would result from sustained military operations. The June 2025 strikes, despite their supposed precision targeting and careful planning to minimize collateral damage, killed hundreds of Iranian civilians, according to credible reports. Iranian authorities speak of 300 dead from direct strikes and subsequent unrest, though the actual verified number may be somewhat different. But in a large-scale sustained war involving thousands of individual strikes over several weeks or months, these initial figures would be absolutely trivial compared to the tens of thousands of innocent Iranian civilians who would inevitably perish from direct strikes, infrastructure destruction, and the collapse of medical and humanitarian systems. Iran is not an empty desert landscape where military planners can strike at will without consequence for civilian populations. This is a highly urbanized modern country, with major cities containing millions of people living in close proximity to military and industrial facilities. Tehran alone has more than 9 million inhabitants densely packed into urban areas. Military installations, nuclear facilities, and Revolutionary Guard bases are often deliberately located near or within populated areas precisely because that provides some protection against attack by raising the political cost of strikes. Every single strike in such an environment carries significant risk of civilian casualties. And in a sustained campaign lasting several weeks involving thousands of individual strikes against dispersed targets, civilian casualties are not unfortunate exceptions or accidental collateral damage. They are statistical certainties that must be honestly factored into any serious assessment of what this war would actually mean. Would American public opinion, already deeply exhausted by 20 frustrating years of inconclusive war in the Middle East, with little to show for enormous sacrifice, accept such a devastating human cost from a new and even larger conflict? The polling data on this question is unambiguous and should give pause to any political leader considering military action. Even among Trump's strongest and most loyal supporters in his political base, enthusiasm for a new Middle Eastern war diminishes rapidly and dramatically when the likely human casualties and financial costs are honestly discussed rather than minimized. Donald Trump himself is famously obsessed with his image as a dealmaker and peacemaker who can negotiate solutions that eluded his predecessors, and he has repeatedly expressed his desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize as validation of his diplomatic achievements. How does he reconcile this carefully cultivated aspiration and self-image with launching a devastating war that could realistically kill tens of thousands of civilians and drag on for years without clear resolution? This fundamental internal contradiction within Trump's own psychology and within his administration's messaging constitutes precisely the first sign of strategic weakness that Iranian authorities have astutely identified and are actively exploiting through their negotiating posture and public statements. Tehran understands with sophisticated clarity that Trump desperately needs quick, visible results that he can claim as victories. The midterm elections are approaching with alarming speed for Republicans, and the party could realistically lose their congressional majority if economic conditions deteriorate or if an unpopular war dominates headlines. Trump simply cannot politically afford to get bogged down in a prolonged military conflict that drains resources, dominates negative news coverage, and produces a steady stream of American casualties without clear progress toward victory. The Iranians, operating under a completely different political system without electoral pressures, can afford to wait patiently for conditions to shift in their favor. They have been doing exactly that for 47 years through multiple American administrations of both parties. They can continue doing it for decades more if necessary because their political survival does not depend on approval ratings or election cycles. This temporal asymmetry between the two political systems is absolutely fundamental to understanding the strategic situation and why Iran holds advantages that raw military power cannot overcome. The United States operates on electoral cycles of 2 to 4 years that create constant pressure for visible results and make sustained long-term strategic patience nearly impossible. Iran operates on generational timescales, where leaders think in terms of decades and historical legacy rather than news cycles. When Iranian officials publicly state that America has been making threats for 47 years without following through decisively, they are not engaging in gratuitous provocation or empty rhetoric for domestic audiences. They are reminding Washington and the world that the Islamic Republic has already survived 8 different American presidents with varying approaches, decades of comprehensive economic sanctions designed to collapse their economy, and a devastating 8-year war against Iraq that was actively supported by Western powers providing intelligence and weapons to Saddam Hussein. Resilience in the face of external pressure is not merely an abstract concept or talking point for Tehran. It is lived historical reality proven through decades of difficult experience that shapes their strategic confidence. But here is where the true nightmare for Washington really begins, and I need you to pay very close attention to this dynamic. The real catastrophe only starts after the first American missiles are launched because Iran would absolutely not be fighting this war alone as an isolated nation. Despite the documented weakening of some of its proxy networks through Israeli operations and internal conflicts, the Islamic Republic retains allies and considerable leverage throughout the entire region that would be activated immediately upon American attack. Hezbollah in Lebanon, though weakened by recent conflicts with Israel, is far from destroyed as a military force and still possesses tens of thousands of rockets and missiles capable of overwhelming Israeli air defenses and striking cities throughout the country. The Shia militias operating in Iraq, though divided among competing factions with different agendas, remain a considerable combined force capable of targeting every American installation and diplomatic facility in that country with sophisticated weapons. The Houthis in Yemen, despite years of intensive American and British airstrikes attempting to degrade their capabilities, continue to successfully harass international navigation in the Red Sea and have repeatedly demonstrated an ability to strike targets deep inside Saudi Arabia with precision. An American attack on Iranian territory would instantaneously activate all of these regional fronts simultaneously in a coordinated response designed to impose maximum costs. The Strait of Hormuz, that critical maritime choke point through which 20% of all global oil trade passes every single day, would immediately become an active and dangerous battlefield. Iranian fast attack boats armed with anti-ship missiles, extensive fields of naval mines that can be deployed rapidly, shore-based cruise missiles targeting tankers and warships, and potentially swarms of suicide drones would all be deployed to disrupt or completely close this vital waterway. The economic consequences of such coordinated regional escalation would be immediately catastrophic, not only for the United States, but for the entire interconnected global economy. Oil prices would almost certainly explode beyond $150 per barrel within days of conflict beginning, potentially reaching $200 or higher if the strait is effectively closed. Inflation throughout the Western world, already a serious economic and political concern, would rapidly become completely uncontrollable. Global supply chains that depend on Middle Eastern oil and stable shipping routes, barely recovered from pandemic disruptions, would be paralyzed once again, with cascading effects throughout every economic sector. And critically, it would be the American economy, far more than the Iranian economy, which has already adapted to severe sanctions over decades, that would ultimately bear the greatest damage from such disruption. Saudi Arabia understands this dangerous regional dynamic perfectly well, which is precisely why Riyadh, despite its intense rivalry and ideological competition with Tehran, does not actually want the Islamic Republic to completely collapse or be destroyed by American military action. This seems counterintuitive until you understand Saudi strategic thinking. The Saudis genuinely fear that a democratic Iran liberated from its current ideological constraints and international isolation would rapidly become the natural dominant regional power that its geography, population, resources, and historical legacy suggest it should be. A weakened Iran suffering under sanctions but still standing as a functioning state actually serves Saudi interests by keeping their rival contained but not eliminated. An Iran engaged in total war with the West threatens the immediate security of the entire Arabian Peninsula through direct retaliation and regional destabilization. This careful Saudi calculation explains precisely why Riyadh firmly refused American requests for access to its airspace for strikes against Iran, despite all the diplomatic pressure Washington applied. The kingdom simply does not want to be perceived throughout the Muslim world as an accomplice to what would be framed as Western aggression against a sovereign Muslim nation defending itself. The domestic political consequences within Saudi Arabia and throughout the region would be completely unpredictable and potentially destabilizing to the monarchy itself. Now let me address the fantasy of regime change that neoconservatives continue to promote. The idea that Iranians would welcome American bombs as liberation is a dangerous illusion. Yes, significant portions of the population aspire to freedom and criticize their government. The protests demonstrated this when thousands died demanding change. But there is a fundamental difference between criticizing your own government and supporting foreign military aggression against your nation. In Iraq, part of the population initially welcomed American intervention in 2003 as liberation from Saddam Hussein. But quickly, foreign occupation became the primary problem uniting previously opposed factions. Iran would experience this dynamic amplified because Iranian nationalism is far older and more deeply rooted. This is a nation with thousands of years of continuous history, refined culture, and distinct identity never colonized by any foreign power. Even Iranians most critical of the Islamic Republic would oppose foreign aggression. American bombs would not produce uprising against the government. They would produce national rallying behind it. History offers a troubling parallel: Vietnam. In the 60s, America possessed overwhelming superiority. It dropped more bombs than during all World War II combined. Yet it lost, not militarily in tactical sense, as America won virtually every battle, but strategically, politically, morally, it was total defeat that traumatized a generation. Vietnam was poor, technologically backward, without sophisticated missiles or regional allies. Yet it defeated the greatest military power in history through determination, resilience, and patience. Vietnamese understood they simply needed to hold until political cost for Washington became unbearable. Iran would apply exactly this strategy, but with superior means. Missiles capable of striking regional bases, allies opening multiple fronts, population 4 times larger than North Vietnam, experience of 47 years of successful resistance, proving patience defeats superior military power. I want to hear your analysis of this situation because these questions will determine global politics for years to come. Do you think the United States is truly prepared for the full consequences of a sustained war with Iran? Do you believe the American political system, with its divisions and short attention span, can sustain a prolonged conflict against such a determined and prepared adversary? What do you think would happen to global oil prices, to inflation affecting ordinary families, to American standing and credibility in the world if this war becomes the quagmire that historical analysis and regional expertise strongly suggests it would become? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. I read every single comment, and I actively engage with my audience because your perspectives and insights help me refine and improve my own analysis of these critical issues. If you found this strategic analysis valuable and you want to understand what is really happening in the world beyond the superficial coverage, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Share this video with everyone you know who needs to understand what is genuinely at stake here, because these decisions will affect all of our lives. The mainstream media consistently gives you a sanitized and simplified version of events that serves certain political interests and avoids uncomfortable truths. I give you the honest, strategic assessment based on historical evidence, military analysis, and genuine understanding of how these complex dynamics actually work in the real world. I'm Michael Harris, and this is exactly the kind of deep strategic thinking you can expect from this channel. The coming weeks could determine whether the United States enters a devastating conflict from which it may never fully recover its position and credibility. Stay informed about what is really happening. Stay vigilant about the narratives you are being fed. Question everything you hear from official sources with agendas. And I'll see you in the next video where we continue this critical analysis.